The desperate signal. James Carter leaned back in his worn pilot's chair, staring out at the endless expanse of stars through the cracked window of his aging ship, Stellar Hawk. Space was quiet tonight, too quiet. It had been weeks since his last cargo run, and his supplies were running low. He adjusted his headset, hoping for a message from a nearby station or ship. Instead, all he got was static. Just as he was about to give up and set the autopilot to the nearest trading hub, a faint voice broke through the silence. "Help, please. Anyone, help me." James froze. The voice wasn't human. It was soft, melodic, but there was a sharp edge of fear. He adjusted the controls, clearing up the signal. The voice came again, more broken this time. "They are coming. I can't escape." James frowned. His ship wasn't equipped for rescues. He was just a freelancer with a rusty vessel barely held together by duct tape and luck. But something about the desperation in that voice made him hesitate. Whoever this was, they were in trouble. The coordinates pinged on his screen. The signal was coming from a planet deep within a war-torn zone known as Carrion 5. It was a death trap. Anyone who went there rarely came back. James muttered to himself, "Don't do this, Carter. It's not your fight." But he couldn't shake the feeling that if he ignored this, he would regret it. He leaned forward, gripping the controls. "All right, let's see what kind of mess you're in." The Stellar Hawk shuddered as it entered Carrion 5's atmosphere. The planet was a wasteland of smoking craters and jagged cliffs. Fires burned in the distance, and black clouds of ash swirled in the air. James's ship's sensors beeped wildly, warning him of dangerous levels of radiation and enemy patrols nearby. "This just keeps getting better," he muttered, guiding the ship toward the source of the signal. As he flew lower, he spotted wreckage scattered across the terrain. Ships, buildings, and bodies. It was clear a massive battle had taken place here, and whoever survived wouldn't last long. The signal grew stronger as he approached a cluster of crumbling ruins. James scanned the area and saw movement, something small, crouched behind a collapsed wall. He grabbed his comm device and spoke into it. "This is James Carter of the Stellar Hawk. I've picked up your signal. Do you copy?" There was a long pause. Then the voice came again, trembling. "Help, please. I'm here." James's heart raced. He adjusted the ship's landing gear, touching down on the unstable ground. The ship's alarms blared, warning him of nearby hostiles. He ignored them, grabbing his blaster and a med kit before stepping outside. The air was thick with smoke, and every breath burned his lungs. He followed the signal through the ruins, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The place felt like a graveyard, silent except for the distant sound of explosions. "Hello," James called out, his voice echoing. A faint sound caught his attention. A weak cough. He turned a corner and froze. There, huddled against a broken pillar, was an alien girl. She was young, barely an adult by human standards. Her skin was a pale silver, glowing faintly in the dim light. Her long, flowing hair was tangled, and her eyes, large and golden, were filled with terror. She tried to stand but collapsed again, clutching her side. Blood, dark and shimmering, seeped between her fingers. James approached slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here to help." The girl flinched, her gaze darting around as if expecting an attack. "No, they'll find me. You shouldn't have come." "Too late for that now," James said, kneeling beside her. He opened the med kit and started inspecting her wounds. They were bad, deep gashes that looked like they'd been made by claws. "Who did this to you?" She didn't answer, her body trembling with exhaustion. James worked quickly, applying a bandage to stop the bleeding. "Can you walk?" She shook her head. "They'll kill us both." James looked up, scanning the ruins. His instincts told him they didn't have much time. Whoever they were probably already on their way. He scooped her up in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her frame fragile but tense. "I'm getting you out of here," he said firmly, heading back toward his ship. The girl's head rested against his chest, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" James hesitated, then replied, "Because you asked." Suddenly, a loud screech echoed through the air. James turned to see dark shapes emerging from the shadows. They were massive, with glowing red eyes and sharp, jagged claws. The girl stiffened in his arms. "They're here," she whispered. James ran, his heart pounding. The creatures were fast, their heavy footsteps shaking the ground. He reached the stellar hawk and slammed his hand on the controls to open the hatch. The creatures were right behind him, their guttural growls filling the air. With a final burst of energy, James leaped into the ship, the hatch closing just as one of the creatures lunged. Its claws screeched against the metal, but the ship held. James set the girl down in the co-pilot's seat and jumped into the pilot's chair. "Hold on," he said, firing up the engines. The stellar hawk roared to life, lifting off just as the creatures swarmed the area. As they broke through the atmosphere, James glanced at the girl. She was staring at him with a mix of fear and gratitude. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lyra," she said softly. "Thank you." James nodded, his grip tightening on the controls. He didn't know what he'd just gotten himself into, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. Escape under fire. The stellar hawk soared through the upper atmosphere of Carrion 5, its engines screaming in protest. James cursed under his breath, glancing at the damaged display. Red lights blinked all over the console. The ship's shields were holding, but barely. Lyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, her golden eyes wide with fear as the ship jolted violently. "They won't stop," she whispered, clutching the armrests tightly. "The assassins are relentless. They'll follow us until one of us is dead." James shot her a glance. Cheerful thought. Can we at least outrun them? No. Lyra shook her head. Their ships are faster, and if they've sent hunting drones. As if on cue, the ship's sensors blared. 4 small, sleek objects appeared on the radar, closing in fast. "Hunting drones. Great," James muttered. "They're going to ruin my day." He jerked the controls, sending the hawk into a steep dive. The drones followed, their crimson lasers lighting up the darkness of space. James's ship rocked as one beam grazed the hull, sending sparks flying. "Hold on," he yelled, flipping switches on the console. A turret slid out from the underside of the ship, and James aimed it manually. With a steady hand, he fired, the turret's shots illuminating the cockpit with flashes of light. One drone exploded into a ball of flame, but the others adapted, zigzagging through his fire. They were faster than his targeting system could track. "Can't you shoot them all?" Lyra asked, panic creeping into her voice. "Not unless they stand still and pose for me," James shot back. "Got any bright ideas, Princess?" Lyra hesitated, then reached for a panel on the console. Her fingers trembled, but her movements were precise. "I can disable them, if I link into their control network." James frowned. "You can do that." "I can try, but it'll take time." James glanced at the radar. The drones were closing in again, their lasers carving dangerously close paths around the ship. Time wasn't a luxury they had. "All right, do it," he said, gritting his teeth. "But if this doesn't work, I'm blaming you." Lyra closed her eyes, placing both hands on the console. A faint glow surrounded her fingertips as alien symbols began to appear on the screen. James tried not to stare, but it was hard to ignore. Whatever she was doing, it wasn't human. The glow intensified, and Lyra's breathing became shallow. Her body tensed, and her voice was barely audible. "They're connected. I just need to override." "Work faster," James shouted as another laser skimmed the ship, sending it into a sharp spin. He fought the controls, leveling the hawk just in time to avoid colliding with a floating mass of debris. Lyra's glow suddenly flared brighter. The cockpit lights flickered, and the radar display glitched. For a moment, James thought she'd fried the entire system, but then the drones on the radar vanished, one by one. "What did you do?" he asked, staring at the screen. Lyra opened her eyes, her glow fading. She looked pale and exhausted, but managed a weak smile. "I sent a self-destruct signal. They're gone." James let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Remind me never to underestimate you." The relief was short-lived. A new alarm blared, and James turned to see a massive ship on the radar, a battleship, 10 times the size of the Hawk. It had been waiting for them in orbit, and now it was locking onto them. Lyra's face fell. "That's the Royal flagship. They've sent her." James's stomach sank. "Her? Who's her?" "The Crimson Huntress," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My stepmother." The battleship's weapons began charging, its glowing cannons illuminating the darkness. James clenched his jaw and tightened his grip on the controls. "Well," he said, forcing a grim smile, "it's been a while since I've outrun a queen." Lyra stared at him, her fear giving way to something else. "Hope, maybe. You can do it." James grinned. "Watch me." With a sharp pull on the controls, the stellar Hawk dove toward the planet's surface again, weaving through the wreckage of battles past. The battleship's cannons fired, the blasts narrowly missing them. James pushed the engines to their limit, the ship groaning in protest. "You're going to burn out the thrusters," Lyra warned. "Better than getting vaporized," James replied. As the Hawk sped through the chaos, James spotted a narrow canyon ahead, its walls jagged and unforgiving. It was a dangerous route, but it was the only cover they had. "Hold on tight," he said, steering the ship into the canyon. The battleship's weapons couldn't reach them here, but the risk of crashing was high. The ship scraped against the canyon walls, sparks flying as James maneuvered through the tight space. Lyra gripped her seat, her eyes wide. "This is insane." "Welcome to my life," James said, sweat dripping down his brow. The canyon opened up into a vast clearing, and James saw a hidden cave on the horizon, his chance to hide and regroup. He pushed the engines one last time, diving into the cave just as the battleship's searchlights swept over the canyon. Inside the cave, James powered down the ship, plunging them into darkness. The silence was deafening, but for the first time in hours, they were safe. Lyra looked at James, her voice soft. "You didn't have to save me." James leaned back in his chair, exhausted but alive. "Yeah, well, I've got a bad habit of doing stupid things." She managed a small smile. "Thank you." James looked at her, the weight of their situation sinking in. "Don't thank me yet, princess. We're just getting started." The deadly jungle. The cave was cold and damp, but it offered James and Lyra a brief moment to breathe. Outside, the sounds of the Crimson Huntress's flagship echoed faintly through the canyon. Lyra leaned against the cave wall, her silver skin glinting faintly in the dim light of the Hawk's emergency lamps. James was rummaging through a storage compartment, pulling out what little gear he had left. "We can't stay here long," he muttered, strapping a small blaster to his belt. "The Queen's goons will figure out we're hiding. If we don't move fast, we're as good as caught." Lyra didn't answer immediately. She was staring at her hands, her golden eyes clouded with doubt. Her earlier show of power had drained her, and the faint scars on her arms told a story she wasn't ready to share. "They won't stop," she said finally, her voice low. "Even if we escape this planet, she'll send more. You've put yourself in danger for nothing." James paused, turning to look at her. "You're alive, aren't you? That's not nothing. Now, come on." Lyra hesitated but stood, her legs still shaky. As they exited the cave, the planet's jungle spread out before them like a living nightmare. Massive trees with glowing bioluminescent vines towered overhead, their roots twisting into unnatural shapes. Strange sounds echoed in the distance, low growls, the snapping of branches, and the occasional high-pitched screech. "This doesn't look friendly," James said, scanning the area with his handheld tracker. "But it's better than waiting to get caught." Lyra stayed close, her steps cautious. Carrion 5's jungles are dangerous. Even the locals avoid them. There are creatures here, predators that don't belong in any natural ecosystem. The warlords used to release them as weapons. James raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's comforting. Let's make sure we're not on their dinner menu." As they moved deeper into the jungle, the air grew thick with humidity, and a strange mist clung to the ground. James's tracker beeped occasionally, warning of movement nearby. Every time, they froze, listening for signs of danger. It wasn't long before they encountered their first obstacle, a massive pit hidden beneath a thin layer of leaves. James nearly fell in, catching himself at the last second. "Watch your step," he said, shining a light into the pit. The bottom was lined with jagged spikes, and the faint glint of bones suggested it had claimed many victims before. Lyra knelt beside the edge, her fingers brushing the ground. This wasn't natural. Someone set this trap recently. James's eyes narrowed. "Great, so it's not just the wildlife we have to worry about. Someone's hunting us." They pressed on, their pace quickening. The sounds of the jungle grew louder, more hostile. At one point, they stumbled upon a carcass, a large reptilian creature with its throat torn open. Lyra covered her mouth, her expression grim. "This isn't right," she whispered. "Even predators don't kill like this." James scanned the area, his grip tightening on his blaster. "Let's keep moving. Whatever did this might still be nearby." Minutes later, they heard it. A low, guttural growl that sent a chill down James's spine. He turned, his blaster at the ready, but saw nothing. The growl came again, this time closer. Lyra grabbed his arm, her voice urgent. "Run." They bolted through the jungle, dodging low-hanging vines and leaping over roots. The growls grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something massive crashing through the underbrush. James glanced back and caught a glimpse of it. A hulking beast with 6 glowing eyes and claws the size of swords. "Any ideas, Princess?" he shouted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Keep running," Lyra yelled, her voice laced with panic. They burst into a clearing, only to find themselves face to face with another danger. A pack of smaller predators, their sharp teeth gleaming in the faint light. The larger beast closed in behind them, its growl shaking the ground. James raised his blaster, ready to fight, but Lyra stepped forward. Her hands glowed faintly as she spoke in a language James didn't understand. The smaller predators hesitated, their snarls turning into low whines. They backed away slowly, disappearing into the jungle. James stared at her. "How did you do that?" Lyra didn't answer. Her focus was on the larger beast, which was still advancing. Her glow flared brighter, and the beast stopped, its massive head tilting as if confused. For a moment, it seemed to consider retreating. Then, with a deafening roar, it charged. "Move!" James shouted, pulling Lyra out of the way just as the beast swiped at them. Its claws tore through a nearby tree, splintering it like paper. James fired his blaster, the shot striking the beast's hide, but barely slowing it down. Lyra's glow faltered, and she stumbled, her energy spent. "Not good," James muttered, firing again. The beast roared, shaking off the hits and lunging at them. Suddenly, the ground beneath the beast gave way. The hidden pit trap swallowed it whole, its roar turning into a pained howl as it landed on the spikes below. James stared, breathing hard. Well, that's one problem solved. Lyra collapsed to her knees, her expression distant. There will be more. James knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Then we'll deal with them, one step at a time. Lyra looked at him, her fear slowly giving way to determination. You don't know what you've gotten yourself into, human. James smiled grimly. Story of my life. The jungle fell silent. But the danger was far from over. They had survived this encounter. But James knew the real battle was just beginning. The enemy's trap. The hidden clearing where James and Lyra had taken refuge seemed quiet, too quiet. The eerie silence of the jungle had settled around them, broken only by the faint hum of the Stellar Hawk's emergency systems. James crouched by the ship, running diagnostics on the damaged thrusters. Lyra sat nearby, her golden eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. "We can't keep running," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "They'll find us, no matter where we go." James glanced up from his work, wiping sweat from his brow. "You got a better idea. Because right now, running is the only thing keeping us alive." Lyra hesitated, her fingers toying with the intricate necklace around her neck. The faint blue gem at its center pulsed softly, almost like a heartbeat. "There's something I haven't told you." James straightened, narrowing his eyes. "I'm listening." "This," Lyra said, holding up the necklace. "It's a beacon. They're tracking me through it." James's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. "You mean to tell me we've been lighting up like a target this whole time?" Lyra nodded, guilt written across her face. "I didn't know at first. But now, I can feel it. It's broadcasting a signal." James groaned, rubbing his temples. "Unbelievable. And here I thought the jungle was the problem." Before Lyra could respond, a distant rumble shook the ground. James's head snapped up, his hand instinctively reaching for his blaster. The rumble grew louder, a rhythmic pounding like giant footsteps. "They're here," Lyra whispered, fear creeping into her voice. James grabbed the necklace, yanking it off her neck in one swift motion. "If this is what they want, let's give it to them." Lyra's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" "Setting a trap," James said, tucking the necklace into a small metal case. He locked it shut and tossed it into the jungle. "Come on, we've got to move." They sprinted deeper into the jungle, the pounding footsteps growing closer. James led the way, weaving through the dense trees and leaping over tangled roots. Lyra followed, her breathing ragged but determined. "What's the plan?" she asked between gasps. "Buy ourselves some time," James said. "If they think the beacon's still active, they'll go after it. That'll give us a chance to figure out our next move." They didn't get far before the first enemy appeared, a hulking assassin draped in black armor, its glowing red eyes scanning the jungle. James shoved Lyra behind a tree, raising his blaster. The assassin's head turned toward him, and for a moment, they locked eyes. Then it charged. James fired, the bolt striking the assassin's chest and shoulders. It barely flinched, its heavy boots crushing the undergrowth as it barreled toward him. He dodged at the last second, the assassin's massive blade slicing through the tree where he'd been standing. Lyra cried out, her hands glowing faintly as she tried to summon her powers. The glow flickered and died, her energy too depleted to summon anything substantial. "Not now," she muttered, frustration clear in her voice. James ducked under another swing, firing again. This time, his shots hit the assassin's helmet, cracking the visor. It stumbled back, momentarily dazed. "Run," James shouted, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her deeper into the jungle. The pounding footsteps continued, more assassins closing in. James could hear their guttural voices in the distance, barking orders in a language he didn't understand. "They're spreading out," Lyra said, her voice trembling. "They're hurting us." James's mind raced. They couldn't keep running blindly. The assassins were too well coordinated, and the jungle's terrain was working against them. He stopped abruptly, pulling Lyra into a thicket of vines. "All right, new plan," he said, panting. "We set the trap here." Lyra frowned. "What kind of trap?" James grinned, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. "The kind that gets them off our backs." Using vines and broken branches, James quickly rigged a crude snare. He coated the vines with sap from a nearby tree, its acidic smell making Lyra wrinkle her nose. "What is that?" she asked. "Something nasty," James said. "These trees secrete it to keep predators away. It burns like hell. Let's see how these assassins like it." The sound of crunching leaves grew louder. James pulled Lyra deeper into the thicket, crouching low. He held his breath, his blaster aimed at the snare. Lyra stayed close, her body tense. The first assassin stepped into view, its heavy boots crushing the undergrowth. It paused, scanning the area with its glowing red eyes. Another followed, and then a third. James waited until they were directly over the snare. Then he fired, the bolt striking the vines. The sap ignited instantly, sending up a wall of flames. The assassins roared, their armor sizzling as the acidic fire ate away at it. "Go!" James yelled, pulling Lyra to her feet. They ran as the flames spread, the jungle erupting into chaos behind them. For a moment, it seemed like they had escaped, but then the ground beneath them gave way, and they tumbled into a hidden pit. James hit the bottom hard, groaning as pain shot through his ribs. Lyra landed beside him, coughing from the dust. "What now?" she asked, her voice laced with frustration. James looked up. The pit was deep, its walls slick with mud. Above them, the faint glow of the assassin's red eyes appeared, peering down into the pit. James grinned despite the situation. "Looks like we're right where they want us." Lyra glared at him. "You think this is funny?" "Not at all," James said, pulling a small explosive device from his belt. "But they're about to have a really bad day." He pressed the trigger. The hidden betrayal. The ground trembled as the explosion shook the pit's walls, sending a shower of dirt and debris raining down. James and Lyra shielded themselves as the red glow of the assassin's eyes vanished amidst the chaos. The device had bought them time, but not much. The pit's walls were still too slick to climb, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of burning sap. James coughed, his voice cutting through the silence. "That should keep them off our backs for a few minutes." Lyra didn't respond. She was staring at something in her hand, the broken remains of her necklace. The faint blue glow that had once pulsed from its gem was gone, replaced by a dull flicker. "What's wrong?" James asked, noticing the look on her face. "This wasn't just a beacon," Lyra said, her voice trembling. "It was a communicator. My stepmother has been listening to everything we've said." James froze, his mind racing. "You mean, she knows where we are? She knows what we're planning?" Lyra's hands clenched around the necklace. "I thought I could trust it. It was given to me when I was a child. I didn't know she had turned it into a weapon against me." James let out a string of curses, pacing the small space of the pit. "So, every step we've taken, every decision we've made, she's been one step ahead." Lyra nodded, guilt etched into her face. "I should have realized it sooner. I've put us both in danger." James stopped pacing and faced her. "What's done is done. We can't change it. But if she knows we're here, that means she'll send more. We need to move. Now." He scanned the walls of the pit, searching for anything they could use. His eyes landed on a series of jagged roots protruding from one side. They were slimy but sturdy enough to hold their weight. "All right," he said, pointing. "We climb. I'll go first." James grabbed one of the roots and began to haul himself upward. The climb was slow, every muscle in his body protesting as he pulled himself higher. Lyra followed, her slender frame making it easier for her to navigate the slippery terrain. They emerged from the pit into the smoldering aftermath of James's trap. The jungle around them was scorched, the air thick with smoke. In the distance, the faint hum of the Crimson Huntress's flagship grew louder. "They're closing in," James said, scanning the horizon. "We need to disappear." Lyra's gaze lingered on the horizon. "There's an old research outpost a few clicks east of here. It was abandoned years ago, but it might still have supplies." James nodded. "Then that's where we're going." As they made their way through the jungle, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Lyra was quiet, her usual sharp remarks replaced by a distant silence. He glanced at her, noticing the way her shoulders sagged. "You all right?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "It's not just the necklace," she said finally. "There's something else." James stopped, his eyes narrowing. "What aren't you telling me?" Lyra looked away, her golden eyes avoiding his. "The beacon wasn't the only thing she planted on me. There's a tracker. Inside me." James felt his stomach drop. "Inside you? Like surgically implanted?" She nodded. "When I was a child. It's how she always knows where I am." James ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. "And you're just now telling me this?" "I didn't know it was still active." Lyra snapped, her voice breaking. "I thought I escaped her control when I left the palace. I didn't realize she could still find me." James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "All right, we'll figure this out. But first, we get to that outpost." They continued in tense silence, the jungle around them growing darker as the sun set. The outpost came into view just as the last rays of light faded. It was a small weathered building, its walls covered in moss and vines. James approached cautiously, his blaster drawn. The inside was just as abandoned as Lyra had promised. Broken equipment and shattered glass littered the floor, and the air was stale with the scent of decay. But there were supplies, medical kits, rations, and, most importantly, a working terminal. James powered it on, the screen flickering to life. "If this thing still has records, we might be able to figure out how to disable that tracker." Lyra sat beside him, her expression wary. "And if it doesn't?" James glanced at her, his jaw set. "Then we do it the hard way." The terminal's database was surprisingly intact. As James sifted through the files, he found something promising. A surgical device designed for removing implants. "Bingo," he said, pulling up the schematics. "Looks like we've got what we need." But as he turned to Lyra, her eyes widened in alarm. "James, behind you." He spun around just in time to see the glint of a blade. An assassin had slipped into the outpost, its black armor blending with the shadows. James fired instinctively, the blast knocking the assassin back. "Stay behind me," he shouted, positioning himself between Lyra and the intruder. The assassin lunged again, its blade slashing through the air. James blocked it with the butt of his blaster, kicking the creature back. It snarled, its red eyes burning with fury. Lyra grabbed a metal pipe from the floor, her hands trembling. "I'm not just going to watch you fight alone." "Great," James muttered, dodging another strike. "Let's make this quick." The fight was brutal, every blow shaking the small room. Finally, with a well-placed shot, James sent the assassin crashing into a pile of debris. It didn't get back up. James leaned against the terminal, catching his breath. So much for staying off their radar. Lyra nodded, her grip on the pipe loosening. "We need to move fast. She won't stop until we're dead." James looked at her, his determination unwavering. "Then we make sure she never gets the chance." The final showdown. The Crimson Huntress's flagship loomed in the sky above, its massive silhouette blotting out the stars. James and Lyra crouched in the undergrowth at the edge of the clearing, the abandoned research outpost barely visible behind them. The jungle was eerily silent, the predators and wildlife seemingly driven away by the oppressive presence of the Queen's forces. James adjusted the scope on his blaster, scanning the horizon for movement. "They'll be here soon," he muttered. "We're out of time." Lyra sat beside him, her golden eyes fixed on the beacon device James had rigged from the outpost's scraps. It pulsed faintly, a lure meant to draw the Queen's forces to a precise spot in the jungle, one filled with hidden traps James had hastily constructed. "They'll know it's a trap," Lyra said softly, her voice tinged with doubt. "She's not foolish. She'll expect this." James didn't look away from his scope. "Maybe, but expecting a trap and surviving it are two different things." Lyra hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. "You've already risked too much for me. You don't have to fight my battles." James finally turned to look at her, his expression serious. "This isn't just your battle anymore. She's made it mine too." Before Lyra could respond, the sound of approaching ships cut through the night. James's heart pounded as he saw the faint glow of searchlights in the distance. The assassins were coming, and they weren't subtle. "Here we go," James said, gripping his blaster tightly. "Stay low and stick to the plan." The first wave arrived on foot, heavily armed assassins moving in coordinated formation. They spread out, their glowing red eyes scanning the jungle for any sign of their prey. James watched from his vantage point, his finger hovering over the trigger of the remote detonator. "Wait for it," he whispered to himself as the assassins drew closer to the beacon. Lyra stayed close, her breath shallow. She could feel the tension radiating from James, but she also knew he was right. This was their best chance to even the odds. The lead assassin approached the beacon, its clawed hand reaching out to inspect it. James smirked and pressed the button. The jungle erupted in chaos. Explosive charges buried beneath the soil detonated, sending fire and shrapnel tearing through the enemy ranks. The assassins screamed as the ground beneath them collapsed, revealing pits lined with sharpened stakes. The carefully laid traps worked flawlessly, taking out most of the first wave. "Nice," James muttered, already preparing for the second wave. But the victory was short-lived. Overhead, the flagship began deploying drones, small, fast-moving machines armed with plasma cannons. They swarmed the jungle, their bright lights cutting through the smoke and darkness. "Drones incoming," James yelled, firing at the closest one. His shot connected, sending it spiraling into a tree, but more replaced it. Lyra stepped forward, her hands glowing faintly. She focused, drawing on the last reserves of her energy. A pulse of golden light erupted from her palms, frying several drones in midair. But the effort left her staggered, her knees buckling. "I can't keep doing this," she gasped. James caught her, helping her to her feet. "You don't have to. Just hold on a little longer." The jungle trembled as the flagship's cannons began firing, their blasts tearing through trees and sending debris flying. James knew they couldn't hold their ground much longer. "They're going to level this place," he said grimly. "We need to take out that ship." Lyra's eyes widened. "Take out the flagship? That's impossible." James grinned, a reckless glint in his eye. "Not with the right distraction." Before Lyra could protest, James pointed toward a narrow path leading deeper into the jungle. "There's a clearing ahead. If we can get to higher ground, I might be able to take a shot at their engines. It won't destroy the ship, but it'll slow them down." Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "I'll cover you." They moved quickly, dodging plasma fire and weaving through the trees. The higher ground wasn't far, but the assassins were relentless. James fired over his shoulder, taking out two more as they closed in. When they reached the clearing, James set up his rifle, aiming for the glowing engines of the flagship. He took a deep breath, steadying his hand. "Come on, just a little closer," he muttered as the ship hovered into position. Behind him, Lyra fought off another wave of drones, her glowing hands sending bursts of energy through the air. She was visibly weakening, but she refused to stop. James exhaled and pulled the trigger. The rifle's shot streaked through the night, striking one of the flagship's engines. The explosion rocked the ship, causing it to list to one side. "Direct hit," James shouted, but his victory was short-lived. The remaining assassins converged on their position, their weapons trained on him and Lyra. Lyra collapsed, her energy completely spent. James stood protectively in front of her, his blaster raised. "If this is it," he said, his voice steady, "I'm taking as many of you with me as I can." But before the assassins could attack, a sudden roar filled the air. The jungle trembled as a massive beast emerged from the shadows. A creature James had fought long gone after their earlier encounter. It barreled into the assassins, scattering them like leaves. James seized the moment. "Let's go," he said, grabbing Lyra and making a break for the tree line. As they disappeared into the jungle, the flagship continued to burn, and the Queen's forces scrambled to regroup. James knew the fight wasn't over, but for now, they had survived. Lyra looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "You're insane." James grinned, his adrenaline still pumping. "Yeah, but it's working. A new beginning." The jungle was eerily quiet as James and Lyra stumbled out onto a rocky plateau overlooking the smoldering wreckage of the Crimson Huntress's flagship. The ship was grounded, one of its massive engines still burning, and the once unstoppable assassins were now scattered, retreating into the shadows. James collapsed against a jagged rock, his chest heaving. His blaster dangled loosely from his hand, its energy cells depleted. Lyra sat beside him, her silver skin pale, and her golden eyes dull from exhaustion. They had survived the impossible, but it hadn't come without cost. "You okay, Princess?" James asked, his voice hoarse. Lyra gave a weak smile. "I think I've been promoted to survivor." James chuckled, though it quickly turned into a cough. He gestured toward the wrecked flagship below. "Well, we gave her something to remember us by." Lyra's gaze lingered on the burning ship. "She'll rebuild. She always does. This isn't over." James straightened, his face serious. "No, but it's a start. And now she knows you're not running anymore." Before Lyra could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. James instinctively raised his blaster, but what emerged from the jungle wasn't an enemy. It was the massive beast that had saved them earlier, its glowing 6 eyes fixed on the two of them. James tensed, his finger twitching over the trigger, but Lyra raised a hand. "Wait." The beast lowered its head, sniffing the air around Lyra, before letting out a low, rumbling growl. To James's surprise, it didn't attack. Instead, it backed away, its massive form blending into the shadows once more. "What was that about?" James asked, his brow furrowed. Lyra smiled faintly. "It knows we're not its enemy. And maybe it saw something worth protecting." James shook his head in disbelief. "You're full of surprises." The distant sound of engines brought them back to reality. A smaller ship descended from the clouds, its sleek design unfamiliar but unmistakably friendly. The emblem on its side marked it as a vessel from the Resistance, a group of freedom fighters opposing the Crimson Huntress's reign. "They found us," Lyra whispered, her voice a mix of relief and hesitation. The ship landed softly, and the ramp lowered. A group of Resistance fighters emerged, their weapons lowered but their expressions cautious. The leader, a tall alien with dark, angular features, approached James and Lyra. "You're the one who grounded the flagship?" the leader asked, his voice sharp and commanding. James glanced at Lyra before nodding. "That was us. Got room for 2 more." The leader studied them for a moment, then extended a hand. "If you're enemies of the Crimson Huntress, you're friends of ours." James shook the alien's hand, then turned to Lyra. "Looks like we got a ride." Lyra hesitated, her gaze lingering on the jungle behind them. "This isn't the end for me," she said softly. "There's still so much to do." James placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this anymore." Together, they boarded the Resistance ship. As it lifted off, Lyra watched the jungle fade into the distance. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar: hope. James leaned back in his seat, exhaustion finally catching up with him. "So, Princess, what's next?" Lyra looked at him, a faint smile on her lips. "Revolution." James grinned, his eyes closing. "Now that's something I can get behind." As the ship disappeared into the stars, the Crimson Huntress's empire trembled. A human and an exiled princess had sparked something far greater than a fight. They had ignited a rebellion.